Feldman. I'm the Executive Vice President and Policy Advisor here at the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis. And I think this is about as distinguished a panel as we've ever had here at the Fed during my roughly 20 years here. And so why don't I do a quick introduction. It's going to be impossible to do justice to the backgrounds of the people on the panel, so I'm just going to be superficial, and you can read more details later. So the presenter is going to be John Bavenzi. John is currently a partner at Oliver Wyman. He was formerly the Chief Operating Officer of the FDIC and was involved in really any substantial resolution-related work there for a very sustained period of time. He's also the co-chair of the Bipartisan Policy Center's Resolution Task Force and will be speaking in part about the paper that the center produced. So John will talk for 30 minutes, and then we'll move on to our panelists, who will talk for 15 minutes each. So I'll introduce them. So Ben Bernanke, former chair of the Board of Governors, former chair of the CEA, and currently a distinguished fellow in residence at the Brookings Institution. I think that's a good example of how superficial one could be relative to one's accomplishments, but I think that hits the high notes probably. Christopher Flowers is the managing director and CEO of J.C. Flowers, and that's really a firm, a private equity firm focusing on financial services institutions. And I think the key here to the resolution part is, I think anytime there is any financial institution of any significant size or importance that looks like they're going to be put in play, Mr. Flowers' firm is going to be part of that discussion. Richard Herring is the Jacob Safra Professor of International Banking and Finance at Wharton. Dick has been working on resolution-related issues, resolution planning, bankruptcy, et cetera, for a very sustained period of time, and I think among finance and economics professors is certainly at the top of the ledger. And then finally, David Skeel is the Samuel Arist Professor of Corporate Law at Penn Law School, affiliated with the Hoover Institution's work on resolution, very distinguished and prolific author on issues related to bankruptcy resolution for financial institutions. So with that, why don't we turn it over to John to get started. And then once the panelists are done, we'll give John a little bit of time to give additional comments if you have, and then we'll put it back to Q&A.
Thank you, Ron. Thank you, President Kashkari. I appreciate the invitation to be here to speak to all of you today and to be with such a distinguished panel. I've been asked to speak about the too big to fail problem, in particular, to set the stage, how far have we come, what remains to be done, and can we get there? My short answers are there's been significant progress, but the most important work remains incomplete. We can get to an acceptable solution over the next couple of years, but it will take a strong and sustained commitment by the FDIC, the Federal Reserve, and the banking industry. Some of what I'm going to discuss today is from a May 2013 report published by the Bipartisan Policy Center titled Too Big to Fail, The Path to a Solution. It's a report I co-authored along with Randy Gwynn, who's here today, and Tom Jackson. Other parts will represent my personal views on what's happened on the too big to fail issue since the financial crisis and where we need to go from here. I see 6 major developments that provide reasons for optimism. Can you hear me okay in the back? Okay. None of which, importantly, existed prior to the financial crisis. The first is a change in attitude regarding the need to end too big to fail. Second, a legislative framework for resolving insolvent banking organizations, requiring that banks develop credible living wills as well. Third, the significant increase in capital and liquidity, and I should add their testing as well to that since the crisis. The fourth is the development of the single point of entry resolution strategy, which helps deal with many difficult operational cross-border issues. Fifth is the recognition that large banks need to hold significant amounts of long-term subordinated or bail-inable debt. And six are the actions that are underway to prevent counterparties from terminating financial contracts upon the insolvency of a systemically important financial institution. However, there are two important steps that will have to also be taken. I can hear myself better now. That worked.
Very smooth.
There are two important steps that need to be taken by the FDIC, the Federal Reserve, and the banking industry before we can end too big to fail. Everyone will need to stay the course, and there'll have to be much greater clarity and transparency in the process. I'm going to expand upon each of these steps, why they're important in the effort to end too big to fail. But let me mention one key point. As this process unfolds, almost certainly, I believe we're going to see significant restructuring in the banking industry. If we follow these steps, which are underway, I'm suggesting that the market will affect appropriate structural changes on a case-by-case basis within parameters that are set by government regulators. To me, this is far preferable than the alternative, which is to impose some arbitrary changes with some uncertain outcomes in a more across-the-board manner. And I'll talk about that as well. Okay, the first important point, the change in attitude. And I think this is really important. Since the Great Depression, bank bailouts have been the rule, not the exception. Private sector losses, other than to capital insolvent small banks, has been pretty rare. And so whether you're talking a small bank or a large bank, one way or another there are bailouts. And I'd be glad to expand upon that if somebody wants later, since not since the Great Depression, but at least since the early 1980s, I've seen much of this happen. As for large banks, few people even wanted to talk about the possibility of imposing losses on large bank creditors. The prevailing view seemed to be that too big to fail would always exist, so why even try? Many held the view that it would scare the public if we started to talk about effectively addressing large bank failures. So let's just accept the fact that it's inevitable we're going to have bailouts and financial crises and go from there. As a result of this, there was no real progress in the 25 years following the failure of continental Illinois. But now views have changed. There's an enormous amount of intellectual firepower being devoted to this issue. And as a result, there has been significant progress. For somebody like me that's sat in an agency knowing this is out there, but not seeing anybody talking about it for a long time, except for occasional places like here at the Minneapolis Fed and a few others, this is a really welcome development because the progress that's been made has been enormous. And I guess it's, no crisis goes to waste. Second, the positive development was the legislation providing a framework for handling the resolution of large banking organizations and the requirement that these banking organizations develop credible living wills. Prior to the 2008 financial crisis, there was little to no advanced planning on how to handle the failure of a large investment bank or AIG or anything like that, nor was there the viable framework for dealing with the resolution of such firms. So when the crisis came, the Federal Reserve and Treasury had to improvise. They did an exceptional job under the circumstances, which I would say even if certain people weren't here, but they did. But obviously a better framework and more advanced planning is necessary. Title I requires systemically important financial institutions to develop credible living wills to show how they'll be resolved under the bankruptcy code. As someone who ran an FDIC-owned bridge bank during the crisis, I know, and didn't have any advanced planning, I know how valuable that can be to have credible living wills. Initially, these plans were judged on informational completeness. Now they're judged on credibility. 5 of 8 recently were determined to be non-credible by the FDIC and the Fed. 3 of the 8 were not determined to be non-credible in government speak, and none got an official credible. I think rather than highlighting the inevitability of too big to fail, I think this shows the seriousness the process is taking and the growing rigor of the living will process. The bank's 2006 submissions will have to correct serious deficiencies, and by 2017 address other shortcomings. The intent is that by 2017 that all of them would be resolvable under the bankruptcy code. If they haven't, the Federal Reserve and the FDIC have the authority to effect significant changes, whether it be increases in capital, liquidity, or required divestitures. And the process is having an impact, and it's important to note the structure of our largest financial institutions is beginning to change. Banks are migrating their critical shared services to service companies. They're creating service-level agreements for key inter-affiliate services. They're codifying building databases for their financial contracts. Some firms are shrinking. Most are reducing their operational complexity. They're starting to better align their business operations with their legal entities, and they're increasing and better positioning their capital, long-term debt, and liquidity to be better prepared in the event of insolvency. Granted, the living will process is very much a work in process, but the pressure for credibility and the pace of change is accelerating. As you know, Title II created the backstop framework for resolving large, complex financial institutions. It created several important things: the bridge financial company creation, the automatic stays for domestic contracts, and the orderly liquidation fund as a source of liquidity. And we'll talk more about liquidity in a little bit. The third important point and reason for optimism is the post-crisis improvement in capital and liquidity. It helps in two important respects. First, the probability of failure for individual institutions is reduced. And second, the likelihood there will be a chain reaction of SIFI failures at the same time also is reduced. While both points are important, I'd like to expand a little on the second, perhaps less obvious point. It's generally been accepted that when a large bank fails, there likely will be multiple large bank failures. And if there are multiple large bank failures, it's far more likely that policymakers will resort to taxpayer bailouts. Thus, we need to reduce the likelihood that one large bank failure will create others if we are to end bailouts. In your April 4th symposium, my colleague at Oliver Wyman, Till Shurman, a key architect of the Federal Reserve stress tests, made the point that the Fed's annual stress tests now show that all of the large banks have far more than enough capital to survive an economic disaster on par with our most recent financial crisis. In fact, even after such a scenario, the largest banks would still have as much capital as the entire banking industry did in 2006. This suggests it would take some combination of a severe economic downturn and an idiosyncratic event to bring down a single large financial institution. That isn't to say it can't or won't happen. It most certainly will at some point. But every bank and organization could face a severe economic downturn at the same time, which is part of the reason why in the past multiple large banks would become insolvent at the same time. However, if there's far more than enough capital in the system to deal with that, then you also need that adverse idiosyncratic event, which by definition is much less likely to affect financial institutions than it is to affect a single one. Thus, I think the post-crisis increase in bank capital and liquidity is an important step, substantially reducing the likelihood that one large failure automatically will lead to multiple large bank failures, and thus taxpayer bailouts. Not the only factor, but an important one. Fourth, a single point of entry resolution strategy. This provides a vehicle through which a SIFI's most important legal entities can remain open and operational in the event of insolvency. Only the parent holding company has to be shut down and placed either into bankruptcy or Title II proceedings. The single point of entry strategy materially reduces the challenges by, if you're left operational, I mean, one of the biggest problems was a large bank failure. You can't just shut things down. It's too disruptive. And keeping everything open and operational also eliminates a lot of the complex cross-border issues, facing an effective resolution strategy. And thus, if it can be made effective, it's a way of getting rid of a lot of the complications that previously existed. Countries may still, ring fence if they feel there isn't enough capital and long-term bail-inable debt in their jurisdiction to protect them. But the U.S. is protecting itself against such a possibility by requiring U.S. Intermediate holding companies that are intended to hold sufficient levels of capital and liquidity in the U.S. That kind of pre-positioning reduces the likelihood of the hosted operation, that a hosted operation will fail when the home country operation fails. But even if you end up with a multiple point of entry strategy where the holding companies fail in more than one jurisdiction, you get a lot of the same benefits from single point of entry because those critical subsidiaries can remain open and operational. So it's a big step forward. I think much of the credit for single point of entry goes to the FDIC, and one person who worked a great deal on it at the FDIC at the time was Jim Wigand. Okay, a fifth reason for optimism is a growing recognition that SIFIs need to hold enough long-term subordinated debt to cover losses that exceed capital and to recapitalize the banking organization should it enter resolution. And this was discussed this morning, but the requirement that banks hold more long-term debt flies in the face of historical practice. Banks borrow short-term money, namely deposits, in order to lend long-term money. However, these significant maturity mismatches, with those, we've really had too much of a good thing. The downside is that short-term creditors can run, which can wipe out much of the economic gain created by bank lending. And federal deposit insurance will protect some short-term creditors, restraining their desire to run, but that still leaves other short-term creditors susceptible to runs. And while long-term debt is more expensive than short-term debt, its advantage is it cannot run. It's there. If it's structurally or contractually subordinate to other bank liabilities, then taxpayers can be off the hook, as that money will be available to cover losses once capital is depleted, and if structured right, can be used to recapitalize the bank. Importantly, then, short-term creditors at operating companies need not be exposed to losses. They need not have the same incentive to run. The Fed's made the proposal that the global SIFIs headquartered in the U.S. maintain substantial amounts of long-term debt to cover at the holding company level, and that this can be used to protect taxpayers. And it will be important that the Fed finalize this rule. In fact, it's critical. I mean, long-term debt requirements, or TLAC, go hand in hand with a single point of entry to help create an effective resolution. And sixth, is the ability to prevent counterparty termination of financial contracts upon resolution. We've seen it because their financial firms are interconnected with each other. Failure of one can lead to the failure of another. And at Lehman Brothers, we saw what can happen if someone fails a SIFI and the counterparty cancels the contract, sells the collateral that's associated, creates a fire sale of assets. We have problems that can affect other institutions and create that downward spiral. But we've had three big developments that can help alleviate this problem. First was in the Dodd-Frank Act. They created the authority for domestic counterparties that there would be an automatic stay till a company was either put in bridge or whatever that would prevent counterparties from canceling the contracts. This affected domestic contracts, but not other contracts. And secondly, in 2014, 18 of the world's largest firms agreed that they would abide by
an automatic stay on such contracts. This covered a majority of the contracts in the world, but again, not all of them. And finally, 2 weeks ago, the Fed has put out a proposal that would prohibit G-SIFIs from entering into financial contracts with any firm did not agree to an automatic stay in the event of resolution. Once that Federal Reserve rulemaking is finalized, we'll have taken an enormous step toward ending some contagion effects. There'll still be interdependencies between financial institutions, but a major reason why they created harmful spillover effects will be gone. Okay, let me spend a couple minutes on the things we need to worry about. There are two main ones that I see. First, the FDIC, the Fed, and the banking industry need to stay the course. This won't be easy. Memories fade, the pendulums swing, but we need to finalize a lot of these things that are in process. The Fed's TLAC rulemaking, the automatic stay rulemaking, and importantly, follow through on the living will process. It's picking up momentum, but if we're starting to reach a point where structural changes are going to be an inevitable result, it's going to take the follow through to make sure that we stay the course. And the fact that there'll be structural changes means the stakes are high, and we don't fully understand the implications of restructuring our financial system. And I think, if you believe you can end too big to fail, you might favor some form of arbitrary rulemaking to help, whether it's increase capital substantially, reduce size, an across-the-board measure. I think this kind of process where you have the government set some parameters, force institutions through living wills to decide on case-by-case changes is preferable. You combine that with the fact that long-term debt holders are not going to like the fact that they're the ones at risk, and they're going to, their money may be fairly expensive in the absence of structural changes to reduce size, complexity, and opacity of the institutions they may be putting long-term money into. And finally, the FDIC and the Federal Reserve are going to need to provide much greater clarity and transparency. This will be difficult since it's not in the nature of bank regulators to be clear and transparent. But if we're going to end too big to fail, the public and the market really need to understand what's going on. And if you're a long-term debt holder or a potential long-term debt holder, you need to understand you're at risk so you can price appropriately and help push for the appropriate changes in the industry. If you're a short-term debt holder, you have to understand that you're far less at risk, so you reduce the incentives for runs. And I would just say finally, we can do all that. It's doable. And as was talked about this morning, a key problem is the short-term debt can run and create those spillover effects. Until all this is in place and you start really getting experience in doing things, you can never know for sure. So the final point here is that we need to make a clear distinction between capital and liquidity in our system. If the government provides money to replace capital, then it's providing a taxpayer bailout. Whether the money gets repaid or not, the taxpayers have been put at risk and creditors have been protected. It's a bailout. But if it's clear that money lent is for liquidity purposes, then I think most of the world, or most people would agree it's not a bailout. It's what's called a lender of last resort, traditional function in the banking industry, given the nature of the banking industry, that the Federal Reserve has had to provide short-term credit at high interest rates on a fully secured basis to solvent institutions. And I think the Fed will need to clarify its role as a lender of last resort. There'll be some who will argue that's a bailout, but under the circumstances it was set up for, it seems to me, an appropriate backstop for what's probably the most thorny issue of ensuring that there's adequate liquidity when you have a failure of a SIFI. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. One of my takeaways is going to be that I agree with a lot of what John said. It seems to me that there's a lot of progress been made, and a lot more is still in train toward reducing the risks that large, complex financial institutions pose for the financial system and for the economy. So to say that nothing has been done is just not correct. Now that said, because it's really important to get this right, thoughtful debate on this issue is extremely important. In that respect, I congratulate the Minneapolis Fed and thank you for inviting me to participate. Now, in saying that there's progress, I'm not here to advocate complacency by any means. I think it's entirely possible that in order to end too big to fail, that there will have to be major structural changes in the financial industry over time. The problem is that we really don't know at this point what those changes are going to be, what they're going to look like. So instead, what we have is a process in place that I believe if we continue to work with it and in a sustained and dedicated way, that ultimately is going to help us find, in a search sense, find those structural changes that we need to achieve a better system. And as I'm going to talk about a little bit today, a key element of this strategy is that it's going to provide incentives to induce financial institutions to shrink or restructure in order to meet their, to reduce the risk that they pose to the financial system. So from an economist's point of view, I'm going to argue that part of what is going on is an attempt to deal with essential uncertainty and asymmetric information in the regulatory process. Now, of course, the simplest thing to do, and I don't know how many supporters there are among economists, but broadly there are certainly supporters of simply, quote, breaking up the big banks, by which I assume is meant setting a size limit of some kind on assets or liabilities. So let me talk about that for a few minutes, and partly because I want to address that particular strategy, but partly because it also contrasts with what is being done in terms of the way it deals with asymmetric information and uncertainty. So in talking about the breakup strategy, let's first stipulate that modest size reductions are not going to accomplish very much. After all, Lehman Brothers was about a third the size of the largest banks when it failed. So clearly, if we're going to get banks small enough that no one believes that there would be any risk of bailout, then we would have to do pretty substantial reductions in size. Now, I would argue that, again, that structural change, I'm not ruling out structural change by any means. I think we may have to see quite a bit of structural change, but this is not a very efficient type of structural change for a couple of reasons. First, and this may sound trite, but nevertheless true, sometimes there's advantages to having big firms in an industry, not just in banking, but in other industries as well. Now, certainly, too big to fail is a very big problem, and there are other concerns associated with size, like, as Professor Zingales talked about today, the political influence, although I would point out that small banks have an awful lot of influence as well. But as in other industries, large financial firms can have cost advantages in some areas and can provide services that other firms may not be able to provide. Potential advantages of size for banks not associated with too big to fail status include the ability to exploit economies of scale in technology, in establishing networks, and in branding, greater diversification of risks, the spreading of fixed overhead costs over many activities, the ability to offer combinations of complementary products, and global reach. Even putting aside the short-term costs and disruptions that would likely be associated with breaking up the largest banks, in the long run, a U.S. financial industry without large firms would likely be less efficient, providing fewer services at higher cost. And then there's the question of international competition. If the U.S. did this and other countries didn't, what effects would it have on the U.S. economy, U.S. jobs, and U.S. profits? Now, I want to also acknowledge immediately that there's a lot of debate about the economies of scale in banking. And I think econometrically, although I certainly can point to good studies that find economies of scale, that given that size is endogenous and that there's a lot of heterogeneity in banking and so on, that the econometric work is going to be very hard for that to be dispositive. But that being said, I think that the uncertainty is in itself a reason to be careful. And here I would point to what Shari was saying earlier about price and quantity regulation. In particular, limits on size are a form of quantity regulation. That could be very expensive kind of regulation if you're very uncertain about the benefits of what the benefit function looks like as a function of size. So I would advocate not necessarily maintaining current sizes, but in trying to reduce size and complexity in a way that is attentive to the different business models and the heterogeneity that exists in the banking industry. The second objection to a strategy based basically on breaking up large banks is that, notwithstanding the phrase too big to fail, size is not the only relevant attribute of banks. It's just too hard, tongue twister, to say too big, too interconnected, too legally complicated. I'm having difficulty to name all the characteristics that that affect whether a firm can be safely resolved or allowed to fail. And in particular, there's a lot of research, some before the crisis, some since, that suggests that the relationship between bank size or the distribution of bank size and financial stability is quite uncertain. And to give just a very simple example, Canada, which has only large banks, did very well both in the 30s and in the recent crisis in terms of financial stability, whereas the United States, with many small banks, did not do so well. So there are many characteristics of banks that are relevant to the too big to fail problem, not just size, and a sophisticated strategy will have to look into those as well as looking at simple size. So those are some objections to the straightforward, what seems like the simple approach of just breaking banks up into small pieces. So what is the current strategy for tackling too big to fail? Obviously, I'm not going to lay this out. You're all familiar with it. But let me just conceptually talk about two elements which I think which bear on what I want to talk about, which is how the strategy tries to deal with information and uncertainty problems. So there are two parts of the current strategy. The first one is the increased regulatory attention that's being paid to firms that potentially pose financial risks. So, for example, on top of generally strengthening bank capital regime, there's a lot of special attention paid to the biggest firms. For example, the largest banks, as you know, have a surcharge, which is tied, a capital surcharge, which is tied to their a variety of characteristics, including size, but including other issues like complexity and the types of business model they have, and so on. Other examples are the stress tests, which are tougher and more frequent for the largest firms, tougher standards, the Volcker Rule, other things that apply most specifically to the largest firms, the fact that the regulators have specific subgroups within their own regulatory structures that are focused entirely on the largest firms. So the intent of these rules and practices is obviously to make these firms safer and to put extra standards of safety on the biggest firms. But there's an additional effect, which is to make them a little more uncomfortable also. And here I'm reminded of Professor Zingales' comment that good regulation will make the regulatee squeal a little bit. So part of the reason for these regulations is actually to impose some cost on large and complex firms. And I'll come back to that in a minute. The second part of the program for Ending Too Big to Fail is the ongoing development of the failure resolution regime, including both Title I and Title II, the orderly liquidation authority that John was talking about. And I won't repeat all that he discussed. I think there's a lot of interesting stuff going on, and I also commend the FDIC in particular for their leadership in this area. But some of the innovations and developments, just to list, the single point of entry, which greatly simplifies the effort. The TLAC, the total loss absorbing capacity, the subordinated debt, which enhances the capital that the banks have. The living will process, the provisions for qualified financial contracts and stays on short-term debt, a whole variety of things, and most importantly, the extensive planning process which is going on. So this is not something that has to be put together in a weekend anymore. This is something that's been planned for years to think about how an individual firm would be tackled if it did come to harm. So the second part of the program is again, is the resolution regime. Now, what I'd like to argue in the last couple of minutes of my comment is that this current approach, this two-part approach, if pursued vigorously, is going to lead eventually to smart structural change as needed to reduce or eliminate the too-big-to-fail problem. But again, for the economists here, I want to point out how this fits into regulatory theory. Three elements. First, to the extent that there's quantity regulation or diktat from the regulators, the efficient thing to do is to let firms have as much freedom as possible to figure out how to achieve the objectives in a cost-minimizing way. So in particular, the living will process is not about saying you cannot be so big. It's about saying we have to be confident that you can be resolved, and it requires a whole variety of different changes. And the firm has to take the leadership, figuring out how to make that standard in a way that meets the regulator's requirement, but also, obviously, given that they have the discretion, will be, all else equal, cost minimizing. The second, and I think better example probably, is the fact I was talking before about how the regulatory strategy, which is aimed at the largest, most complex firms, to some extent it acts like a Pigouvian tax. That is, you want to take away the benefits of being too big to fail and increase the costs. So an example would be the fact that firms that have a capital surcharge recognize that they believe that's expensive. Whatever Modigliani and Miller might tell you, they think that having a higher capital standard is expensive. And they also are facing these more difficult regulatory regimes and so on. And you're seeing, and I think there can be no doubt that firms do not like being under this regime. They've been suing, as MetLife did successfully, to get out from under this regime. Other firms have gotten out from under or reduced the oversight, like in particular AIG and GE Capital, by actually restructuring and selling off assets and the like. So I think that this provides a certain Pigouvian incentive for firms to try to internalize the social costs of their size and complexity, which again will use the information that the managers, the board, and the shareholders have that the regulators don't have in order to figure out how best to reduce size. And the third element, which would be the most familiar, of course, is market discipline. And there is a sense in which as creditors become more and more uncertain that they will be bailed out, they're going to begin to exert more and more discipline on the decision process being made by firms. And in particular, one of the things they'll provide incentives for is to reduce and simplify. And I think it is of interest, although I wouldn't take it as conclusive, that the major rating agencies are now downgrading the big banks on the grounds that the assurance that they would be bailed out by the government, the so-called uplift associated with the presumption of government support, is being reduced or eliminated by the rating agencies. So again, I want to say that what I see here is not a success, a solution. Surely that there's a lot more to be done, and that could very well involve considerable structural change. But what I do think is that we do have a good process in place, which, given strong leadership, and regulation always requires good, competent, strong, determined leadership, but given strong leadership, will move us, I think, over time towards a solution to this problem. Again, within the process, and one of the advantages of the process is that there's plenty of scope for us to debate the parameters and the details. There's a lot of discussion about how much capital should banks hold, maybe 100%, maybe 20%, maybe 12%, whatever it is, within this framework, which is, again, about trying to come to the necessary structural changes. That kind of issue is implicitly or explicitly part of the debate. So we'll need to continue to test the assumptions and the parameters of the process, but the point is we're not waiting for some single strike. We have an incremental process in place that over time, I believe, will take us where we need to be. Thanks.
Thank you all for having me today at this glamorous gathering here in Minneapolis. I feel a little intimidated being here because I think every single person here has a PhD, and I admit that I made it through college, but I never got any farther than that. So I'm out of my depth, but I'm going to try. Let me say that I bring to this the perspective of a equity investor and a private equity investor, by which I specifically mean not on the public markets, but negotiated deals. And our company specializes only in financial services. We've operated at least a dozen banks around the world, many regulated insurance companies. I will admit that those are not usually SIFIs, although I'll come back to that in 1 second. By the way, I've been around long enough that I personally was involved when Continental Illinois was bailed out. That's how far back I go. So that's a lot of bailouts over my time. We looked at Bear Stearns. We looked at Lehman Brothers. We actually offered, in partnership with a sovereign wealth fund and a giant insurance company, to put $10 billion into AIG on Lehman Brothers Sunday for a private bailout of AIG, which everybody ignored, which was an interesting experience for me. You know, today we actually do have an investment in a SIFI, which is CIT. I'm going to come back to that in 1 second. The core point I want to make is that I don't see this economy functioning without very large financial institutions. I just don't think it will work. Just like I don't think it will work without, for example, airplanes. It is true that back in 1880 we had no airplanes and we didn't have any giant banks that were too big to fail. So you could have an economy that worked that way, but every kind of customer today, you know, big governments, big investors, big corporations around the world need financial institutions of this size. They need them. And, you know, it's not, I mean, I'm sure it is a matter of economies of scale and stuff like that, but what it also is institutions, A, with the ability to do large undertakings. Ability to do large undertakings. If you want to sell, you know, tens of billions worth of bonds, or you want to do the biggest IPO in history, or something like that, it cannot be done by small financial institutions. And so I think it's essential to have these big institutions, just like it's essential to have airplanes. And so the trick is, which I'm going to come back to in a moment, to make them safer. That is the trick, is to make them safer rather than to say, we don't need them, let's not have them. The trick is to make them safer. And then the nexus there, though, is that means in the sense I'm going to say in a second, we can't eliminate too big to fail. We cannot eliminate it. If we're going to have financial institutions that are big enough to serve the economy, we cannot be in a situation where you're run-of-the-mill ordinary creditor, depositor, somebody with money in custody there, you know, zillions of people like us, you know, our company, for example, in a crisis thinking, I don't know if I'm going to get my money back. It just won't work. It's going to be necessary that those institutions ultimately be in some kind of crisis where their concerns seen to be completely safe, or else the system won't function. So therefore, my own feeling is that we can't eliminate it in that sense, and that therefore what we should be focusing on is making these companies safer. Let me say that, as I mentioned, we have an investment in a company, CIT Group, which is a SIFI. It's on the smallest end of SIFIs. It has assets of around $60 billion. It does sort of local and medium-sized lending. You know, the idea, this is a perfectly good company, by the way, but the idea that like CIT would be the biggest financial institution in the United States, you know, sort of boggles the mind. You know, it could no more serve big investors and big companies, you know, than I could by myself. It just isn't a plausible scenario. Now, in terms of making large financial institutions safer, in my opinion, a great deal has been done, and much to the credit of many people here and elsewhere. There is a lot to be said for that. So, more capital, you know, very fundamental thing. Check mark there. It's been mentioned many times. Much better liquidity, also very important. Big improvement. Big improvements on the way derivatives have been handled. You know, another big step forward. Simplification of how a lot of groups work and pressure on groups to simplify their structure, also a major step forward. And also a lot more clarity and information in the hands of regulators and the hands of the companies themselves just in general. enabling people to manage these risks more effectively. And by the way, one comment I'd like to make, Ben was just talking about the capital surcharges for big banks and how, they don't like that and that's costly. The way the real world works is for smaller banks and medium-sized banks, you have to have that extra capital too, because the rating agencies and the regulators say, well, you're small and you're not diversified and you're more risky, so you have to have more capital. And they say, the big banks, you're big, you're complex, you don't win a bunch of fields, so you have to have more capital. So it really ends up being sort of in my experience, sort of chasing each other in terms of which ones have to carry more capital. Now, let me say something about the single point of entry. That seems to me like a very useful and welcome mechanism to have the regulators be able to take control of a holding company and run the show in an orderly fashion. But I don't see how that is going to answer the following problem which could occur, which is that you have subsidiaries in various places which need liquidity and which need capital. So just because you've got control of the holding company and just because you bail on all the debt holders at the holding company and wipe them out, that doesn't mean that your subsidiaries are going to have enough capital and enough liquidity necessarily. And almost certainly, when a regulator takes over one of the biggest banks in the world and says, I'm running the holding company, I can promise you that as subsidiaries around the world, people will be saying, you know what, I want my money back. I want my money back now. And unless these guys tell me I'm going to get my money back, I'm going to take my money back now. And so I think for this to work effectively, it's going to be necessary to shore up major subsidiaries as well as holding companies. Let me just make 2 or 3 more points. There is a distinction often made, including today, between lending for liquidity and lending for solvency, or we make loans to take care of liquidity, but we're not going to shore up solvency. I can tell you that in the real world, like in September 2008, the question of whether company ABC is solvent or not is not knowable. It is like the Heisenberg uncertainty principle. You can't know. And part of the reason you can't know is that the future is path dependent. There are future outcomes where the company is insolvent. There are future outcomes where the company is solvent. And by the way, the regulators and everybody else's own actions have implications on the future solvency, and it just isn't knowable. And so, maybe the distinction one is trying to make is between secured and unsecured lending. Maybe that's the distinction. But I think that even secured lending, has risk to it, and I think that the people should be very careful about thinking that, well, it's okay to do this for liquidity, but it's not okay to lend for solvency, because that's going to be a very murky thing in the time of a crisis. The idea that a large financial institution will have a living will, in the sense that it will be a plan where a gigantic bank can literally be liquidated or have its subsidiaries sold off in a reasonable period of time, is not a plausible idea. The magnitude of these kinds of things are so large, and there'll be so much chaos going on at the time of a crisis, that there's not enough capital and there's too much risk that you would actually seriously try to liquidate and sell off all the pieces of an institution of this size. It does make sense to me that that these plans and these exercises greatly improve information, greatly assist in managing a big financial institution in a crisis, greatly assist in figuring out the path forward, but that literally you could take a company the size of JP Morgan or Wells Fargo or Barclays and, in a short period of time, liquidate it is not a plausible scenario, and market participants aren't going to believe that. Let me conclude by saying that one last thing, the experience of 2008 in a lot of ways was not encouraging to people like us, and I think that is a point to think about. Rescuers, people who put their money in, people who showed up to provide the capital to bail out companies in trouble, were frequently excoriated, second-guessed, and retraded. And Ben just said, well, it's good when we have regulation which makes the institutions feel uncomfortable and squeal. Well, that's us, okay? So that's us. You're making us feel uncomfortable. You're making us squeal. And so next time one of these things happens and we're going to liquidate JP Morgan and somebody says, okay, would you mind putting $10 billion into this thing? You know, we think about stuff like that. Thanks.
Well, that's a very tough act to follow, as in fact they've all been. First, I wanted to thank Governor Kashkari and Ron for inviting me to participate. It seems especially appropriate to have this discussion at the Minneapolis Fed because I think you've been consistently thinking about these problems for longer than any other institution I know about. And I've been thinking about them since the early 90s, to little effect, I might add. But I think what I might be able to provide is a bit of a historical perspective. Now, let's see. Oh, I actually have control of this. This is good. I'm going to assume that we have a lot of good things going on in prudential regulation and that we've actually succeeded in reducing the likelihood that any of our, I'm going to focus on GSIBs or global systemically important banks, that all of them are less likely to fail. But I think that doesn't suggest we don't also need to tackle the problem of, if it happens, how in fact would we deal with it? I think there's really no end to too big to fail unless you have provided regulators with the tools they need to resolve one of these entities without catastrophic consequences. And I view this basically as a consequence of what I always call Stern's Law after Gary Stearns, I guess your predecessor by two, who has been thinking about this along with Ron for a very long time. And his contention was that you're never going to convince creditors that they'll be subject to risk of loss in a SIFI or GSIB unless the authorities actually have reliable, credible tools that will provide them with an alternative to bailouts. And as you look at this, this is a huge challenge. And it's odd that it was absent from the international regulatory agenda before 2008. Bailouts during the crisis, which by Andrew Haldane's measure resulted in a commitment of about 25% of global GDP to back up the banking system, demonstrated that too big to fail is simply too expensive to continue. And the problems that were implicit in using the standard approaches simply overwhelmed the general assertions that we're not going to bail out any of the institutions because it happened time and time again. The sad thing is that we should have learned from a string of failures that occurred earlier from Herstatt to LTCM because these were all problems that appeared again, but in a larger way with Lehman Brothers. And this was the one time when the authorities held back. They did not bail out Lehman Brothers. And we saw that, in fact, their fears were probably well placed, that the consequences were fairly catastrophic. I'd like to focus on Lehman Brothers because I think a lot of the logic of living wills can be seen in what went wrong with Lehman Brothers. Its asset size was a little over $500 billion. It was indeed the fourth largest investment bank, but not huge by today's standards. It had 25,000 employees, and John Kay made the interesting note in the Financial Times a couple of weeks ago that's actually fewer than the number of compliance staff at Citigroup these days. So it wasn't huge in terms of employees. It had done very, very well in the very recent past. But it had more than 6,000 legal entities, and I say more than because they didn't really know. Nobody had a complete record of all their legal entities in more than 40 countries. They were highly leveraged, more than we knew, because they were playing all sorts of accounting games. They were heavily reliant on overnight repos, which is short-term funding that everybody today has highlighted as an Achilles heel of the system, and they had very extensive interconnections with the rest of the financial system, more than 1 million contracts outstanding at the time of bankruptcy. But here's the key thing. They were managed as one highly centralized single entity, which is typical, I would say, of most global firms. It was so complete, and you would, in some contexts, argue that it was great corporate culture. People viewed themselves as working for Lehman Brothers, not working for a particular sub. In fact, it turned out most employees had no idea what legal entity was actually their employer. And traders booked the trades on various balance sheets with no particular attention or discussion with customers often, because they viewed it as one integrated whole. Many of the operations were located in London because, frankly, the British authorities had really tried to bid for the prime brokerage business by relaxing restrictions on mingling customer funds with the firm's own funds. And that, of course, had been what had made securities firms much easier to resolve than banks, because you had a strict segregation until that point. The holding company, Lehman Brothers International, acted as treasurer for the whole group. This, again, is fairly common practice. At the end of each day, subs would sweep all of their cashes into New York at the holding company. They would invest it overnight and pay it out the next day as needed. Other support services, management information systems, risk management systems, and so forth, were shared among affiliates, and they had, like many firms, patched together an amazing number of software applications, largely because many of the firms grew through mergers and acquisitions and simply didn't take the time to actually refit the management information systems. When it was impossible to find a buyer for Lehman Brothers over that frantic weekend, which some of you know a lot about, they were forced to seek Chapter 11 protection under the Bankruptcy Act before Asia opened. And this, I think, focused everybody on the fact that there is very little time to think about these things if you're seriously going to try to resolve an institution. It was by far the largest bankruptcy in history, completely unprepared. And the bankruptcy process, of course, and this is something we could have learned from Herstatt, gave a first mover advantage to the US bankruptcy authorities, because when we called bankruptcy, all of the liquidity remained in New York, couldn't be redistributed to the other subs, and they all immediately fell into illiquidity, which amounted to insolvency in a lot of places. So there were over 60 bankruptcy proceedings around the world as a result of this intervention. Many of the countries were even less prepared than we are to deal with it. The UK, for example, had no provision for DIP financing. So they really had to beg, borrow, and steal to keep the lights on for the liquidators to figure out what was going on. The centralized record keeping collapsed as soon as they filed. Nobody really knew where all the assets were, because it wasn't really record keeping on the basis of legal entities. The complex intra-affiliate transactions were very difficult to sort out. It was the simple question of who owes what to whom, which is where you got to start in a resolution, was amazingly difficult to disentangle, because the management information system stopped, and then it was sold to Barclays, which quickly integrated it with its own. The actual bankruptcy filing figured as an event of default, which led to the early termination of all the derivatives contracts, some 900,000 of them. And it did prove true that closeout netting and the rapid sale of collateral led to fire sale prices in a number of cases. I think there was a broad consensus that this disorderly resolution exacerbated the crisis. It certainly didn't cause it, but it intensified things by a lot. Part of it was simply because, and I think this is something that we need to reflect on, Lehman was permitted to run on long beyond the point of economic insolvency. And all of these problems are more difficult if a firm is deeply insolvent. Allocating losses is a lot easier if there aren't many losses to allocate. But the tradition has been to pull the trigger much too late. Part of this was a problem that resulted in the moral hazard from the Bear Stearns intervention. Lehman was twice as large, twice as complicated. People thought it would have access to at least twice as much. And so they were probably more relaxed about exercising oversight than they might have been. The losses were extremely difficult to actually compute, to figure out how much you would need to recapitalize it. And you had this heroic attempt to execute an LTCM-like rescue, which in the end proved unsuccessful. The US acted unilaterally without consulting any other jurisdictions, and That too led to huge disruptions because I think we behaved in a way that most foreigners thought was improbable. I think they were pretty much convinced that if we'd done what we did for Bear, we would do it for Lehman. And that led to a string of other failures where people simply lost confidence in the regulatory framework. The U.S. did provide liquidity for the U.S. broker-dealer, and as John pointed out this morning, we were fairly well protected from the immediate spillover because we actually sustained the entity that was most important in the United States. It went through a SIPC resolution, was sold to Barclays rather quickly, and the spillovers we had in the U.S., which I would not say were negligible, I think were largely unanticipated. The first was the collapse of Prime Reserve Fund, which broke the buck and led to a run on money market funds. And that in turn led to dumping of commercial paper as money market funds tried to pay off those who were redeeming cash, which did, I think, lead to some substantial disruptions in the real economy as borrowers were unable to fund their businesses. But the disruptions in international markets were much greater. The officials taking their view of what happened realized that this was not the worst possible case. There were lots of G-SIBs around that had much larger balance sheets, trillions, not billions. They had more extensive interconnections, more complex inter-affiliate transactions, more diverse lines of business, more complex organizational structures, and more extensive international involvement. And they realized that if they were confronted by the collapse, there was simply no plausible way of resolving it without exacerbating financial instability. Bailout seemed the only answer, and when the leaders met in the Group of 20 meeting, the general theme was never again. And suddenly, issues of resolution were catapulted from nowhere on the international agenda to the very top. And I think there's a lot that has happened since then. First, they understood that they were confronting an enormous challenge because an awful lot had to be done over a very short period of time if they were to achieve the objective of recapitalizing, selling, or winding down, and I quite agree that a sale or a wind down is completely improbable over that time, so it really had to be a recapitalization, without destabilizing the financial system and real economy, and without a taxpayer-funded bailout. At best, you would have a weekend, and the weekend would start a clock running where an amazing number of things would have to be done. There's the essential problem of how you'd recapitalize, but in addition, if you're dealing with a firm that's active in 60 countries and perhaps doing 2 or 3 different kinds of business in each country, you would have to coordinate with 3 regulators in, say, 50 countries, 150 different regulators to coordinate how you would deal with it, how you would get permission to continue running after you recapitalized, and how you would deal with access to the shared financial infrastructure. It's really, really tough. But it all has to be done before Asia opens up. So that was what they faced. They asked the FSB and the Basel Committee to develop a strategy to how to deal with it. First, they had to identify who the G-SIBs were, who were we going to worry about. Then they had to devise mechanisms to ensure international cooperation, which is still a work in progress, and I think never will be completed. And they had to establish international standards that each of the authorities was supposed to meet. I wanted to show you the system they arranged for identifying G-SIBs, mainly to indicate that they were more sophisticated than to focus only on size. Now, one could have lots of objections to this, but it actually does provide a bit of the safe harbor that John talked about, because the result of the G-SIB classification is to give differentially higher capital requirements to larger institutions. And you have before you a very clear way for an institution to try to reduce its G-SIB footprint. And a number of institutions have quite honestly and candidly talked about their approach to doing so, and it's resulted in a lot of change, a lot of withdrawal from businesses, some spin-offs. Citigroup, for example, has eliminated 75% of its subsidiaries over the last 4 or 5 years. So it has had a very big impact. But I think it's an interesting example. Now, we could have lots of arguments about whether this is the right way to identify a GSIB. It does seem a little coincidental that each of these indicators has a 20% weight, and I would think it's rather odd to have left out the number of subsidiaries when you're talking about complexity, because it does have a direct impact on resolvability. But nonetheless, it's a much better job of providing transparency into this approach. And it also indicates that they're going to be thinking about a broad range of channels of contagion. Obviously, we have a lot of anticipated benefits. I think I won't dwell on this because we've more or less talked about them. And I think we've also talked about the kinds of requirements it leads to. That's all in the nature of planning, which didn't happen with Lehman Brothers. And it involves things as simple as figuring out all your legal entities, mapping your lines of business into them, and figuring out if it makes any sense at all, to doing some very, very careful inventorying of contracts and permissions and building up your IT systems and your management information systems so that you can run a virtual data room, which is what anybody would need to do if they were going to sell the firm. The U.S. implementation in Dodd-Frank is different from that in the rest of the world because the requirement of the law is that everything be done under the bankruptcy code. And so the FDIC and the FRB have oversight of this process. It's led to living wills. It is a process that matters to the institutions because they can, in fact, impose sanctions. We'll talk about that a little more a little later. The first substantive review, which took place in August 2014, didn't go well. There was a general discussion about things they found that were shortcomings in the eyes of the Fed or deficiencies in the eyes of the FDIC. That's an important distinction because if it's a deficiency, it can lead to a finding of not credible. If it's a shortcoming, it's simply something you should tidy up. And the Fed and the FDIC split at that point. But they did set out where they wanted to see strong improvements. And it appears that in at least 5 cases they didn't. Last month, they announced that 5 of the large USG SIBs had failed to make sufficient improvements and were going to be ruled not credible. That doesn't mean the others are credible. It means they're just not credible, which is an important distinction, actually. The finding is significant because it sets the sanction clock ticking. And the thing that I think is very encouraging, which makes me much more optimistic about this process than I was 2 months ago, is that the regulators have actually released their full detailed letters to each of the firms describing exactly how they evaluated it. They actually praised them for doing some things better and set out deficiencies and shortcomings. I think this is important not only because it obviously imposes greater accountability on the firms, but it also imposes greater accountability on the authorities. We now have benchmarks that people can be held to account for. And I think this is really important to the process because, frankly, neither the authorities nor the firms entered this whole process with an excess of credibility in the eyes of the public. So I think transparency is crucial. There are lots of serious questions about Title I. Can courts really, as currently constituted under current law, meet the need for speed? As we know, markets meet virtually the speed of light, but courts move with all deliberate speed. In fact, the first such international crisis, Herstatt, took 35 years for the courts to resolve, which doesn't really seem to correspond with our view of what needs to be done now. How can we actually include the public interest in a bankruptcy proceeding that's basically designed to protect the interests of creditors? How can sufficient liquidity be provided to fund systemically important functions during the process? We do have DIP financing in the US, but we've never used it on that scale or mobilized it with the speed that everybody believes would be necessary. And I think perhaps as importantly, how can international cooperation be achieved? It's an essential component of the problem if you're dealing with a GSIB because they're active in literally scores of countries. And it seems very odd to even think about a way in which some unidentified judge who's suddenly named to preside over the bankruptcy can somehow negotiate with the variety of international authorities that need to be consulted. I think it's ironic that the people in the U.S. who strongly favor bankruptcy do so in part because they're concerned about arbitrary administrative actions. Yet, if you talk to authorities abroad, they're terrified of what they consider to be the crapshoot of U.S. bankruptcy law, and so they would much prefer a administrative solution. Well, Title II is that, but it can only be used after demonstrating that bankruptcy would be destabilizing and overcoming a number of procedural hurdles that were inserted to make this an unlikely call. You have to have a majority vote of the FDIC, a majority vote of the Fed Board, a memo from the Secretary of the Treasury to the President who all must agree that bankruptcy can't work. Now, if you're thinking about doing this over a compressed weekend and have to get on with whatever you're going to do, it seems unlikely you can devote any time at all to this kind of deliberation. It would, however, provide access to the Orderly Liquidation Authority. It would facilitate an international cooperative solution. And we have the advantage the FDIC has really made extensive plans. There have already been some discussions of single point of entry, so I'll not go into that in any detail, except to point out how clever it is, because it reduces the urgency of radically simplifying the legal structures. If you can avoid having to take each of these legal structures, these thousands of legal structures through bankruptcy, then you've resolved an awful lot of very, very difficult problems. It also reduces the burden of cross-border coordination to the extent that the authorities in host countries can assume that the home country is going to back up the facilities. Now, there is another detail, and that's something that Chris Flowers mentioned, which has long concerned me. And it turns out that if from what one can tell about the new disclosures regarding living wills, they actually have governance triggers that will force the holding company to recapitalize and provide liquidity to the subs before the event of bankruptcy. And they're supposed to take it into account when they figure out when they have to pull the trigger, which answers one of my gravest problems, which is, will it happen soon enough? And there's always the question of, will they have enough capital and liquidity? TLAC's supposed to answer the capital problem, and the governance triggers should minimize the amount which they're going to have, because it will result in very early, prompt corrective action. Will host countries abstain from ring fencing? Well, I agree that it all depends on how well they think they're going to be protected. If indeed these governance triggers work, they may be fairly relaxed. But in the meanwhile, everybody's safeguarding their own stake by requiring pre-positioning of capital and liquidity. And in fact, our intermediate holding company is really having it both ways for us. The question, of course, is can we keep up this momentum? I think there's been huge progress, but one never knows. Where are we now? Well, I think it depends sort of on your attitude toward risk. You can view it as half empty or half full. What we can all agree on is, however, that it's no longer an empty glass, and it was before 2008.
So as the final person to talk, I want to add the final thanks to the Minneapolis Fed and everybody involved in this conference, present company excluded. It's an amazing group of people and a very, very important conference. The topic of our panel, as you all have figured out, is resolution. But like some of the other panelists, I can't resist first saying at least a few words about the prior question of whether we're effectively enough regulating the biggest banks and financial institutions. And like John, I'm going to use bank as a term proxying all large financial institutions. For the past 6 years, the Fed has construed the Dodd-Frank Act as instructing it, and this is a quote from the recent proposed TLAC rules, to reduce major financial companies' probability of failure by requiring the Fed to subject them to enhanced capital liquidity and other prudential requirements and to heightened supervision. The goal then is to manage the largest banks rather than to break them up. In my view, the Fed has done a superb job with this thus far, but let me make 3 cautionary comments about this approach. The first is that as a historical matter, the focus on managing the biggest banks rather than scaling them down or giving them incentives to scale down and promoting competition in the financial services industry is somewhat surprising. In the 1930s, there was a strong debate between advocates of managing the big banks, which was led by economist Adolph Burley at Columbia, on the one hand, and on the other hand, advocates of breaking them up, which is often associated with Louis Brandeis, who later became a Supreme Court justice. In the 1930s, the Brandeisian view largely won out, and one of the signature achievements was the Glass-Steagall Act, which we talked about so much at lunchtime. In the 2000s, by contrast, none of the principal architects of the Dodd-Frank Act were receptive to this view. Although the Fed has regulated very aggressively thus far, and we've heard about some of the things that the Fed has been doing, there remains a risk of what I and others have referred to as corporatism, which is, in my view, a very unhealthy approach to banking regulation. Second, I want to say a word in favor of artificial cutoffs, such as penalties for banks that achieve a certain fixed number size. As long as the banks themselves are the ones deciding how to downsize or otherwise to respond to the penalties they may incur, I think artificial cutoffs actually can work quite well. In the bankruptcy context, private lenders often use a very similar approach, giving a debtor fixed targets as a precondition for future lending and leaving it to the debtor to decide how to meet those targets. This is similar in some respects to some of the comments that Chairman Bernanke was making earlier. Finally, if we're serious about reducing the likelihood that a big bank will fail, but we don't want to break them up, the best way to do this, in my view, is through strict, simple, high equity requirements. When Anat Admati and Martin Hellwig made this proposal a few years ago, I, like just about everybody else I know, thought they had to be wrong. But none of the critiques of their analysis that I've seen withstand scrutiny. Higher equity doesn't have to reduce lending, for instance, and it's not clear to me that equity is more costly than debt other than because of the debt tax subsidy. A great virtue of a strict equity requirement is its simplicity. It's much harder to circumvent than capital requirements and the like, as we've seen in recent years. One strategy for implementing this might be to combine an artificial cutoff, such as $700 billion in assets, with strict equity rules for institutions that exceed that number, somewhat as was proposed by the Brown-Vitter bill a few years ago. Let me now turn to bankruptcy and resolution. What I'm going to say here is very similar to much of what John said. The only difference will be that, to use Dick's yardstick of glass half empty versus glass half full, I'm going to use a little bit of a glass half full, or excuse me, a glass half empty perspective. There'll probably be a little bit of both, but I'm going to focus more on what do we have to worry about and less on what is so wonderful about single point of entry. Before the Dodd-Frank Act was enacted, the resolution framework for financial institutions was highly balkanized. If you were a commercial bank and you ran into trouble, you were resolved by the FDIC. If you were an insurance company and you ran into trouble, you were resolved by state insurance regulators. A financial institution's holding company was resolved in bankruptcy, either under Chapter 11 reorganization or under Chapter 7 liquidation. An investment bank could also file for bankruptcy, but only in Chapter 7, not in Chapter 11, which led to some very interesting gymnastics in the Lehman Brothers bankruptcy. The Dodd-Frank Act took a significant step forward, and a significant step toward reducing the balkanization by giving bank regulators authority over both the holding company itself, which they didn't have before 2010, and over most of the subsidiaries of a financial institution in connection with Title II's orderly liquidation authority. But Title II's language seemed to undercut this by requiring that regulators liquidate any financial institution they took over under Title II. If the liquidation mandate were taken seriously and construed literally, it would, in my view, have made regulators very unlikely to risk a resolution, and the next big bank that ran into trouble, we would have seen another bailout. Fortunately, in the past 5 years basically 5 years, the liquidation mandate has been construed not literally, but very creatively. In the past 5 years, as we've been discussing, the FDIC has developed the single point of entry approach to bank resolution, which is a recapitalization rather than anything that looks like a traditional liquidation. I'm a big fan of SPOE. I was a strident critic of Title II when it was enacted. It struck me as implausible as it was written and conceived by at least some of the lawmakers who were involved in its passage. But SPOE strikes me as an approach that could actually work. I do, however, have a few concerns, and in the time that I have left, I'll just rattle off 5 of those concerns relatively quickly. First, because derivatives and other financial contracts will be fully protected, single point of entry will encourage use and more use of precisely the same short-term obligations that wreaked so much havoc in 2008. More protection is likely to mean more derivatives over time, and this is something Tomas mentioned this morning. This is perhaps a necessary evil. It is something you kind of have to do a single point of entry, but it is very important to keep in mind it is an evil. It is problematic, in my view. Second, because holders of bonds and other long-term debt of the holding company are the ones who will bear the brunt of a restructuring, the big banks will have an incentive to cut back on long-term holding company debt and raise money in other ways, because holding company debt is going to be more expensive, other forms of debt are going to be cheaper. This means that regulators have an entirely new job as a result of single point of entry, and that is they have to force the big banks to keep enough bond debt at the holding company level for single point of entry to work, which is exactly what the Fed's TLAC proposal is designed to do. SPOE will only work if regulators set the TLAC requirements high enough, and not only set them high enough, but keep them high enough after we've forgotten about 2008, despite the fact that the banks have every incentive in the world to try to erode these requirements over time. My third concern is the cross-default problem, which Dick talked, I think, a little bit about. Under the traditional ISDA contract, counterparties to a subsidiary could terminate their contracts if the holding company were to be put into resolution. So a holding company resolution could trigger this termination elsewhere in the subsidiary framework. The ISDA protocol, which has been signed by the 18 leading banks and a number of other derivatives players, is intended to address this problem by effectively putting a contractual stay in place. But so far, the protocol only applies to those who have signed it, and it doesn't cover large areas of financial contracting, the most obvious example being repos. Now, the regulators are smart people. They're aware of this. They are rolling out proposals to deal with this issue. But at this point, the ISDA protocol has limited coverage, and it really only deals with swaps and the like. It doesn't deal with other kinds of financial contracts. As a result, if a big bank were to fail today while we're sitting here, I don't think SPOE would be ready for prime time. Fourth, even if regulators fill in these holes, there still is a significant risk of a run. Once it looks like a financial institution could be taken over, investors will start pulling their funds from the troubled institution. Why mess with an SPOE when you can move your funds somewhere else? If only one institution is in trouble, this won't necessarily be a huge problem. The runs may be manageable. If multiple institutions are in trouble, I think we are in big trouble and we're back in bailout land. Finally, the SPOE process relies on regulators deciding when it's time to pull the plug. Historically, regulators have not been great at intervening in a timely manner, particularly with respect to systemically important institutions. This is why Congress enacted the prompt corrective action regulations for small and medium-sized banks after the S&L crisis in the 1980s. To their credit, regulators once again have recognized this problem with Title II. And reading between the lines in the rather boilerplatey public parts of living wills that we can see, it looks like there's some effort to create some triggers, liquidity triggers and capital triggers that might force, if they worked effectively, an earlier intervention by regulators with respect to the systemically important institutions. But because of the limited disclosure of the living wills, we can't tell. At least those of us who have not been privy to the living will. So it's possible there will be an effort to deal with this problem of regulators waiting too long to intervene, but it's hard to tell, and historically the track record is not great. This seems to me to underscore one of the biggest benefits of bankruptcy as an alternative to Title II or ordinary bank resolution. In bankruptcy, the managers themselves are the ones who make the decision when to initiate the resolution process. Because managers aren't immediately kicked out in bankruptcy, as they are under Title II, or at least they're supposed to be under Title II, they have much more of an incentive to initiate resolution in a timely fashion. It seems to me that this underscores the importance of making sure that bankruptcy can be used whenever possible. There currently is legislation in Congress, it's been passed by the House, it's in the Senate right now, that would facilitate an SPOE-like bankruptcy process by, among other things, authorizing the bankruptcy court to approve a transfer of assets that looks a lot like the SPOE process, a transfer of assets and liabilities on very short notice. There also is a stay, a limited stay, as part of this legislation. This legislation, in my view, would be another very big step towards truly addressing too big to fail. My bottom line is this. Single point of entry and the bankruptcy quick sale are promising, but they're not ready yet. I'm not surprised that the Fed and the FDIC weren't able to call any of the most recent living wills credible. At best, they were not credible in one situation. The city was the only one that was not credible, I think, or most fully not credible. At this point, you can't resolve one of these big institutions effectively under bankruptcy, which is what the living wills are designed to measure. It seems to me that the goal should be to make bankruptcy a serious option for as many of these big financial institutions as possible. So I am not an advocate of repealing Title II, repealing the Ordinary Liquidation Authority, which is what the earlier Senate version of the legislation I've referred to would do. I think Title II should be there. I think single point of entry should be there. But if we could get bankruptcy in shape, hopefully we wouldn't have to use it, or it would be a very, very rare case when we would need to use it. Thank you.
John, did you have anything you wanted to respond?
Yeah, I'll make a couple comments. Can people hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, great. There's a lot there and all great comments, and I think for the most part there's a lot more agreement on what's going on here than there is disagreement. I mean, if I kind of, what I heard was there's some benefits to big banks. There's a cost associated with breaking them up, so you don't automatically want to jump to that conclusion. Big isn't necessarily the major problem. We've talked about interconnectedness between financial institutions, interdependability and complexity, and short-term debt being runnable, the things that can lead to contagion effects, which create a much more difficult problem to solve than the resolution of a single SIFI. We talked about making the large banks safer. I don't know that anybody would disagree with that clearly we weren't in that position prior to the crisis. Capital levels were too low, liquidity was too low. There were a number of shortcomings which are being addressed. I think, a part of the idea of providing clarity and transparency is to try to give some hope for potential long-term investors like Chris Flowers that it's not a completely losing bet to invest in large banks. We're talking about the need for more capital in one way or another. There's been a lot of capital, but the TLAC proposal needs to be put in place. There needs to be long-term debt. I actually prefer the long-term debt to more equity, which I'll mention why in a minute. But if indeed we're doing these things that are reducing the probability of default, it becomes a safer bet. Dick and David raised an important point about the triggers. I mean, we've typically waited too long to close insolvent institutions. That's part of the clarity that needs to be provided in what are the triggers, when are they going to be sprung, and that can potentially reduce the loss given default for those investors as well. And certainly those investors aren't going to come cheaply. There's going to be a price to pay for that, and if the overall health of the industry becomes stronger through whatever restructurings or things that take place, that banks may end up smaller. We're just saying it's not automatic, but certainly the complexity and other things need to be addressed that hopefully on balance, at the end of the day, long-term debt becomes an investment that is of interest to people. But the triggers become critically important and clarifying, because you need information in order to make decisions on whether you want to do this or not. Certainly I agree with David, do everything we can to improve bankruptcy so that it can really be a first option, but given the significance of this, really the most important issue in my mind facing financial regulators, we certainly don't want to take away Title II. And I do believe we need to end too big to fail. We just can't accept it. It goes well beyond some of the things we talked about to how the public just perceives the basic fairness of our financial system, and much of the anger and distrust of bankers and bank regulators comes about because of bailouts and the unfairness of that. And That's only going to get worse if bailouts continue. So I think, whether it's half empty or half full, it's moving, and we got to keep pushing and get there. So those would be my comments.
All right, why don't we open it up for questions? Yeah.
So it's been 8 years almost since Lehman fell, and I guess I'm getting so part of this whole thing was all we were saying is give Dodd-Frank a chance. But at this point, I would say every panelist agrees that if any of these large players, Goldman, Citibank, were to fail today, either through liquidation or bankruptcy, there's no way we're going to do an orderly resolution of these guys now. So is it the panelists and the presenters' opinion that sure we can't do it, it's half full because sure we can't do it now, but if you just give us another 7.5 years, then at that point we're going to be able to do an orderly resolution of one of these guys? Or is it the case that no, it's the other parts of Dodd-Frank that are going to work so well that it's such a low probability event that we don't need to worry about it?
Great question.
I'll start quickly by saying I don't think another 7.5 years is going to cut it with anybody, that the pace either picks up substantially or the pressure for more arbitrary changes is going to take over.
So I'll jump in and say, I think the other parts of Dodd-Frank are working pretty well right now. I mean, my concern about a lot of what we've seen with the stress tests and the use of the living wills is that it's astonishingly non-transparent. I mean, basically, the Fed can do whatever they want to do. I happen to have confidence in the folks who are doing the regulation right now. So I think it actually is working quite well now, and I think the odds of a big bank failure in the near term are really small. So on the first part of your thing, I think we are in a better place right now. On the second part, if there were a failure, I think if it were not one of the biggest banks, I actually think we could do a bankruptcy and it would work out okay. It'd be messy. I'm of the view, a kind of contrarian view on 2008. I think that Bear Stearns should not have been bailed out. I think Bear Stearns should have been let to go into bankruptcy, and I think Lehman would have developed very differently if that had been the case. But with the biggest banks, I don't think we'd see a resolution or a bankruptcy. If Citi were to run into trouble or Bank of America, we'd have a bailout.
I guess I have a bit of concern about the either-or context in which the question was framed. I think it is true that we've made strides with the other parts of Dodd-Frank, but I think resolving one of these institutions that we've put together over decades and hundreds of mergers is really a tough problem. And I'm actually hugely encouraged that we've gotten as far as we have, and that they've actually focused on targets that could get us to the place we need to be. So I don't think we ought to give up on the goal of making it possible to resolve any of these entities, because sooner or later, all of these prudential standards are not going to be enough. And we won't be out of the too big to fail hole until we really do have a clear answer and a reliable set of tools, and an understanding by the public of how they will work. I would echo the points made earlier that it's critical that we not surprise people, that they have an understanding of exactly what happens when a financial institution's position deteriorates.
I just comment is that our regulatory system is astonishingly slow. And it's because there's a very strong presumption that every pronouncement of any kind gets to be litigated. The way even a guidance. So before the crisis, the Fed and other regulatory agencies provided some guidance, quote unquote. This is not a rule. This is guidance on commercial real estate and how much should be held, et cetera, et cetera. And 2 years or 2.5 years after the problem was first identified, through multiple congressional hearings and rule statements and comments and all this stuff, the guidance was finally approved. This is guidance again. So this part of our regulatory system is very much a litigated system, and you can. That's got benefits because it means everybody gets their input to the process, and maybe you get better rules in the long run. But it's very slow. So you have to ask the question: yeah, it's very slow compared to what? Given the nature of our regulatory system, if we wanted to do any other thing, any alternative, it's also going to take a long time. So we just have to, I think, do what we can to prepare. And I'm no longer obviously in the seat, so I can't give you any up-to-date news on that. But it's inevitable that it's going to be a slow process.
I don't want to get myself in any more trouble than I am. I will say this, though. I cannot imagine somebody like Citi being in trouble and that being resolved without guaranteeing something. I just don't see that happening. I don't see that. I don't think you can get there. You take control of the holding company and try to. It's too big. It's just not going to work. I don't think. So we should try to make it safer and less likely, but not say sort of like it's never going to happen. We fix it so it can never happen, and we're never going to ever have to do this ever. You'll notice, by the way, in Europe, they still have reserved in the European rules the ability to support in the end as the last thing, financial institutions in trouble.
Char, you already have the mic, so I can't not call on you.
It's her fault.
Tempted as you would be.
And I think Ben is right that we should think about this as a process. And so the right question is the process headed in the right direction? I'm going to play devil's advocate only a little bit. I'm going to try and argue that the process is headed in the wrong direction. Because what I heard today is, what is the process? The process, as far as I can tell, is very heavily institution-focused rather than instrument-focused. Because it's institution-focused, it asks, how can we help improve the performance of each one of these institutions? One of the shocking things I heard is our objective is to make each of these institutions safer. Is that really our objective? Safer in what sense? Do we really want to make sure that a large non-financial firm like, say, General Electric or Exxon has zero probability of bankruptcy? Why is that an efficient way of organizing activity? Surely the managers, equity holders, and others are going to behave more prudentially and are going to take the appropriate amount of risk if they are confronted with some possibility that they go bankrupt. So I'm concerned that it's institution-focused, not instrument-focused. By that I mean, if the fundamental problem is what John argued this morning, which I think is right, that short-term debt, and Thomas is right about the focus on derivatives on that, if the real externality, if the inefficiency comes from the excessive use of short-term debt, leads to run problems and other kinds of problems, then we ought to be addressing that problem rather than asking how do we make sure that each one of these institutions is particularly safe. Why is this relevant? Ben, of course, knows this history better than me, but I want to remind everybody about the history. Every significant banking crisis in the United States originated outside of the large money center banks. The 1907 crisis came from Knickerbocker Trust, which was not part of a large money center bank. The crises of the 1930s emanated from the Bank of the United States, and then Herstatt, and then subsequently smaller banks in the United States, not from the large money center banks. So focusing on large institutions runs the risk that the next crisis could be coming from some hedge fund that you've never heard of today. So that's, focusing on instruments seems to me to be substantially more important. The current system is uncomfortably close to a command and control system where the regulators are in the business of telling everybody what to do. So the last point I want to make is that I think David Skeel is exactly right. We should think about this as a bankruptcy procedure. And if we think about this as a bankruptcy procedure, and if we can get, it's a hard problem, if we can get Congress to sign on to the idea that, that financial services firms deserve and need a different chapter of the bankruptcy code, then so be it. That's going to lead to much more predictability rather than relying on, as all of us do, the current generation of regulators as being really good people. I don't know how long we can rely on that.
Do we have more confidence in the next generation of judges?
Just respond quickly to your if I may, to Ari's point. So if you assume that there's some benefit, perceived private benefit of the bailout probability, which is not a social benefit, then presumably in equilibrium, if you got rid of that private benefit, you would have safer banks, right? So that's sort of the endogenous response you're looking for. How do you get there? Not by necessarily mandating it, but by creating the right incentives, which on the one hand are the tougher regulations that try to eliminate that externality, and by making it realistic to creditors that you could lose money. So that creates the market discipline. So that's sort of how, it's not that you're making them safer directly, but indirectly you're inducing that behavior, I would argue. Then you're absolutely right about the fact that runs were so critical. I think that liquidity transformations it's a big issue, but I think that arguably, anyway, people have taken the view that liquidity transformation is a big part of what banks do. And you can't necessarily separate them completely from banks. But let's just put that aside. It's certainly the case that maybe while more needs to be done, that other parts of Dodd-Frank and other regulatory changes, including, for example, reforms of the repo market, reforms of money market funds, and so on, are trying to address the liquidity requirements, and so on, are trying to address the run problem. But it is a somewhat separate issue. But you're absolutely right that it is, in some sense, the key to any financial panic is runnable liabilities.
Can I just put a footnote on that, which is Dodd-Frank didn't completely ignore the instruments. It did address the problem with swaps and other derivatives. So we have a clearinghouse approach, which is not uniformly agreed to be an advance. I actually think it is an advance. So I think derivatives are a little more safe than they were before 2010. Dodd-Frank did not, as you know, address other kinds of financial contracts, repos being the big example. It was just almost completely unaddressed in Dodd-Frank.
Let me just add one word of dissent with regard to that. No, I mean, I think Dodd-Frank has done a lot to push derivatives out into central counterparties and clearinghouses. What it did not do was pay attention to how they would be resolved. There is no living will requirement for these institutions, and we're not really sure, in fact, how it would all work. Moreover, the members of these institutions are basically the G-SIBs. They have the deep pockets, and so I think we have to be careful that we haven't solved one problem by creating another even bigger, more systemic problem, because these institutions are huge and getting larger.
By the institutions, you mean the clearinghouse?
Yeah.
Yeah, this is a weed level question compared to the big thing questions, which is in your report, you emphasize the need to distinguish between capital and liquidity. And in practice, my question, and a couple members talked about that, if you have these gigantic institutions with these gigantic, possibly murky balance sheets, and in a very short period of time, you got to decide, is this solvent but illiquid, or and they have good collateral and follow some of the Badgett principles. My question is, in practice, if we're actually going to be able to do it in a relatively short period of time, and you get these monstrously large institutions that have lots of opaque assets, are you going to mark everything to market on a day? How in the world could you do that in a very short couple days to figure out you're solvent, but you're just a liquid, and here's the value of all your collateral, and then here's all this money within a couple days. Just in practice, just the mechanics of the weeds of how you do that. That's my question.
Well, let me start out. I mean, part of what I'm saying is you need the higher capital requirements to reduce those the likelihood that one is going to spill over to another, so that the likelihood that if Bank A is insolvent, then Bank B is going to be insolvent as well. But each of the agencies has supervisory processes with, who knows how many examiners and others inside each of these institutions monitoring them on a daily basis to see their condition and be in a position to determine, what is there for the collateral and what isn't. Now, granted, I'm not acting like it's a simple problem, because it gets awfully murky. as asset values are changing, when you're going to cross that line.
Let me. Do you envision like almost like a daily evaluation of balance sheets? In other words, these institutions are getting a little bit shaky. We all know we're getting closer to a crisis. Do you envision there's almost like a daily evaluation of here's value your collateral, here's value your assets, and all these, whatever, how many there were, 6,000 sub-entities, and we do like a running daily toll, and they cross some trigger and boom. Is that what you have in mind?
That there needs to be, there needs to be heightened attention as an institution's getting in worse trouble, and that's part of the process as well. That well-rated institution doing well, you may pay limited attention to, but certainly during the past financial crisis, the regulators were on the phone on practically a daily basis, just talking about the condition of individual institutions and where they stood and what was happening.
Really quick question. It strikes me that the failure of a large financial institution can spill over into the rest of the financial system, primarily because, and perhaps even solely because of the bankruptcy laws. Counterparties are allowed to seize and immediately sell the collateral, which then has a downward pressure on asset prices generally. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on narrowing the scope of the safe harbor as a potential policy response to this problem.
I'll jump in on that because that's something that I've focused a fair amount on. I think it's essential to narrow the safe harbor. There are some concerns about eliminating the safe harbor. The ones that are most compelling, it seems to me, are that if you get rid of the safe harbor, you're increasing the pressure to run when a financial institution gets into trouble because they're worse off in bankruptcy. There also are, in my view, legitimate concerns about the uncertainty created by the stay. If I've hedged and there's a stay, I don't know if the debtor financial institution is going to keep my contract in place or not, so I've got a difficult decision. Do I re-hedge? Do I take the risk? Those, in my view, don't weigh in favor ultimately of the safe harbors. They weigh in favor of having a short stay, not a long one. So I've proposed a 3-day stay. Others have proposed other things like a 7-day stay. But it seems clear to me that one of the lessons of 2008 was that the stay is a mistake and that the stay fuels systemic damage. It doesn't stop it. Or the absence of a stay fuels systemic damage.
Any other questions from the audience? So I've got a question for the panel. I've got about 5 more minutes. We can start with you, John. So you said you were going to explain why you were in favor of more debt instead of more equity, but you didn't do that.
Yeah, I missed that point, but it was connected to the triggers.
Sure. And one other question, which is, so key to all of this is that the long-term debt holders become equity holders, and that's the essence of all of this. And I don't think I heard in your presentation why that would happen. I mean, so more capital, more liquidity, et cetera, but what are the precise set of things that have occurred to date that would give those that are going to have to make that decision confidence that, in fact, imposing that loss at the time is going to be a good idea? It's obviously related.
Yeah. Well, to me, as to some of the panelists, it's very important that there be clarity on triggers and that you're not taking down an institution too soon. You're not waiting too long. If the TLAC is all capital, it seems like a weird thing to argue against, just a bit more capital, but I'd worry you would never, if you don't have clarity on triggers, that you'd let that kind of wear away before you addressed the issues that would need to be addressed in terms of curing whatever problems the institution had. So you need and just having long-term debt that can be convertible or bail-inable seems to me it sort of delineates a place where you've got that ultimate trigger, which could be helpful. If you can clarify triggers without it, then fine. Let it all be capital. But some form of subordinated debt seems like it would be useful. In terms of, I think also, it's important to have a good amount of this pre-positioned as well. It's not completely clear yet how you're going to ensure it gets there. I would believe that that's quite doable to find a way to, have that contractually, become turned into equity. But certainly, it's simpler to the extent you've got some of that in the institution itself as well. With the resolution of Washington Mutual, you were talking about the 6th largest bank in the country, which was shut down, and it was the subordinated debt holders who covered the cost rather than taxpayers or a deposit insurance fund.
That's an interesting example because the advantage of the TLAC is that people should know, when they buy it, that what the rules are and what the risk is. One of the problems with WAMU, and there's a lot of dispute still today about that, about whether it was the right thing or not to make the senior debt holders take the losses, was there's a lot of confusion about what is precedent is this for other situations, and so the clarity would be a very important part of this process.
Good. Well, why don't we thank our panel before we have Neil come up and give closing remarks.
Thank you. I'll be very brief. I feel like a little bit like John McLaughlin of the McLaughlin Group. I get to wrap up at the end and give the last word. My reaction to this panel, I found it very interesting. I think the panelists generally agreed that if Citigroup were to get into trouble today, Citigroup would get bailed out. I think I heard that. Now, not everybody's, no, okay. Some on the panel said that. But what's interesting is that of all the large banks, Citi was the only one deemed not credible, right? So they're the best of the bunch, and a majority of the panelists think the best of the bunch would still get bailed out today, which I found interesting. The complexity that I heard just is like seared in me. The complexity of these solutions, from SPOE to the TLAC triggering at just the right time, and we're going to have the regulators measuring those assets. Let me tell you something. During the financial crisis, we had no idea what any of these assets were worth. And the hope and prayer that a regulator in 20 years from now is going to know better than the market what these assets are really worth, good luck. If you add to that, it's not just one bank, but it's 5 banks at the same time, forget it. And so I feel a little bit, my experience is so burned into me that maybe it's not fair to compare these plans against what we experienced in 2008, because maybe that is too extreme to defend against. It's possible that in such an extreme scenario, you simply have no other choice. I give Chairman Bernanke and my old boss, Secretary Paulson, tremendous credit, because during the crisis, they had the courage to put the full balance sheet of the U.S. government behind the financial system. And that's what it took to stabilize the crisis, the full power of the Federal Reserve and the Treasury with Congress in partnership to stabilize the crisis. And now what I'm hearing is, well, no, we're not going to have to do that again. Instead, we've come up with this very, very clever, delicate mousetrap. And if we wind this one lever 90 degrees, and we pull this back, and we tap 3 times, and we close our eyes and pray, it's all going to work, and we're not going to need the balance sheet of the federal government. And so, I don't know, call me a big skeptic, but in a time of major crisis, this kind of complexity just terrifies me. I think it's going to have almost no shot of working if we ever face again something like we faced in 2008. And sitting there, I was trying to think of an analogy to get this across. This is a bad analogy, but humor me. It's late in the day, so maybe you'll find this amusing. How many of you have watched the original Star Wars, A New Hope? Original Star Wars, okay? There's a scene when Han Solo and Chewbacca have rescued Princess Leia from the Death Star, and they took R2-D2, who has the secret plans to the Death Star, to the Rebel base. The scientists at the Rebel base take R2-D2 and plug him into their computer and analyze the Death Star, looking for a way to defeat the Death Star. And they say, we've got it, Eureka. We just need this one little X-Wing fighter to fly under the radar through this one narrow channel and hit this one little tiny target, and it'll trigger a chain reaction bringing down the Death Star. And Han Solo and Chewbacca looked at each other like, you're out of your minds if you think that's going to work. Now, it worked because Luke Skywalker, it did work because Luke Skywalker had the Force, all right? So maybe 20 years from now, the FDIC and the Fed can invoke Obi-Wan Kenobi, and the Force will make all these bells and whistles line up just perfectly, and we won't need the taxpayers to step in. Call me a skeptic. But in any case, I'm so grateful for all of the panelists who are here on this panel and our first panel and our lunchtime speaker. This was a terrific discussion. I really learned a lot today listening to all of these different debates go back and forth, and all of this is making us a lot smarter as we think about coming up with potential solutions, alternative solutions, again, that we're going to present by the end of the year. And so nothing but admiration and gratitude for everybody offering their perspective, and for all of you sticking with us here today, also those at home. And to wrap this up, we're going to have a little reception afterwards for those who are here, so we can chat over an appetizer. And then this evening at the U, I'm going to go with Chari and colleagues with John Harwood, and going to have a wonderful town hall with students there. So thank you all very much. I really, really appreciate it.